horse for the bus? What 80% of your packages aren't you going to ship? What percentage of kids aren't you going to have because you can't afford them? What vacations aren't you going to take because it's wrong? I mean, because it's impossible. So these are very real life and death choices that we're talking about. And the only means of providing the value that's being cut is being damned as an addiction and as a curse. And the lifeblood of civilization is being attacked. And the transfusion is sunbeams and wind gusts and manure piles. And that is not a transfusion. Now I realize that this is pretty extreme. It's pretty apocalyptic. I'm claiming that a very popular movement today is advocating policies that will lead to mass suffering and death. And I absolutely believe that, especially if you consider the fact that there are 1.5 billion people in the world who lack electricity. They're the same people who, instead of having even coal to heat their homes, have to burn wood and animal dung and get die from respiratory disease by the millions every year. And what do they do? It's for lack of development. And oil is the essential material for development. It provides you materials, it extracts materials, puts them together, it transports you what you need. The higher the price of oil goes, the higher price of development goes. Ditto for the other fossil fuels. And then there are 3 billion people projected to be added to the Earth's population. Just think about their well-being. Think about the fact that we complain when oil goes up to $5, gasoline goes up to $5 a gallon. That's with a 1 or 2% cut. What do you think an 80% cut means? 1 or 2% cut in supply. I mean, these are drastic things. And so even more, call me an extremist, alarmist, whatever you want. Except, unfortunately, there's a historical precedent for me being right here. Believe me, I don't like being right in this case. There are many movements in history that have condemned industrial civilization or its major products as evil and called for replacing them with some ideal that was allegedly better. Communism is one such movement. But in case you think communism is a far cry from the Green Movement, I want to take an example from the Green Movement. Several decades ago, the Green or environmentalist movement rallied in the name of the evil of industrial civilization and how polluting it is and how many chemicals it has. They rallied to get a certain chemical banned from use in the third world. And this chemical happened to nearly eradicate one of the deadliest diseases known to man, malaria, from the earth. Now, who knows what chemical I'm talking about? DDT. So, and a woman named Rachel Carson, who's a hero of the environmentalist movement to this day, she's from Pittsburgh, where I was speaking last night, she wrote a book called Silent Spring, which condemned the DDT as an evil, didn't give any respect whatsoever to the fact that it had virtually eradicated millions of cases of malaria from Africa and Asia. And she condemned it, and there was a worldwide outcry for this evil chemical product of industrial society and industrial capitalism and all the evils of the world, and we needed to be green and ban DDT. And so we did. And since then, tens of millions of people have died unnecessarily of malaria. Tens of millions of people. And there's been no apology. There's been little to no recognition of this by people in the Green Movement because they felt that their intentions were noble. They were certain that industrial civilization was evil. They were certain that whatever they could find that they thought was bad about it justified cutting off an enormously important part of it, this enormously important chemical. And that's the same mentality that believes that any kind of climate change justifies cutting off 80% of fossil fuels. And notice, you never hear the kinds of things we're talking about today. It's not as if Al Gore gives this presentation and then follows it by an inconvenient truth and weighs the costs and benefits. He never talks about the value. He never really gives an honest discussion of what he's asking to sacrifice, because they don't take seriously the value of industrial civilization. And therefore, that mentality has already killed tens of millions of people. And there's nothing stopping it from killing tens of millions of more if we do not appreciate the value of oil and other industrial technologies. It's that simple. So,
Is DDT back in use?
a bit. I mean, it gets, so as far as DDT, it's back in use somewhat, not nearly enough, but the whole fight against malaria was set back decades, and therefore strains evolved to fight against it. So there's a lot you need to do, and the whole thing was crippled way back when. Anyway, so given the catastrophic harms that are guaranteed if this 80% cut or anything, let alone Al Gore's 100% cut, happens, how do we evaluate something like global warming? And I think looking at the positive value of oil can dramatically clarify how to think about something like global warming. So the most straightforward way is to think, well, if there's a certain incredibly life-devastating, life-killing consequence to the solution to global warming, you had better be damn sure that this is a catastrophic problem, and a catastrophic problem on the order of justifying giving all this stuff up, which is really nothing. I don't know even what it could possibly be short of a giant earth-consuming fireball that just made life impossible for everyone. I mean, if it was that, then we could talk. But that's not it at all. There's no even clear method of predicting what the damage to the climate would be. And the current estimate for what we would benefit from making this incredible cut in our standard of living is that we would save 2.5 degrees of warming. So 2.5 degrees of warming, which of course people say, well, that's catastrophic and we can't live with it. But if you actually make them make concrete what would happen, it amounts to really, really bad weather, which is not a trivial thing, but we need to think about the consequences of really, really bad weather in the context of the power of oil and other fossil fuels. Because there's this assumption that, well, if we have more everything, more hurricanes, rising sea levels, droughts, etc., well, we're just doomed. But industrial power makes the exact opposite true. The more industrial power we have, the more we can deal with any kind of climate, whether it warms or not. The climate is inherently a threat to human life. And the thing that makes us well off is our ability to deal with that threat by molding nature to meet our needs, by building irrigation, by building dams, by diverting water from where you don't want it to where you do, by inventing sunscreen, by building sturdy houses, by having roofs that protect you, by having central heating, by having air conditioning, by having insulation. These are what protect us from the elements. These are what are vital for people around the world. So no matter what the climate, human beings and the thing that makes all of these possible, the thing that allows us to develop these, is industrial power, in particular oil. That's what builds the dams. That's what builds the houses. That's what our real standard of living depends on. And so let's look at history for a couple of examples of this. Over the last century, part of the case for global warming as CO2 being a major cause of global warming is that over the last century it's warmed 1 degree due to what people regard as excess fossil fuel emissions. But let's ask ourselves, whatever changes in the climate have occurred over the last century, are we better off or worse off than we were a century ago with all those sources of power? Because everything we have was built by these fossil fuel generating forms of power, and yet our life expectancy is double what it was. Our lives are infinitely better, and we're far, far, far less vulnerable to the climate. We're much less worried about the climate than people were 100 years ago because we have industrial power. To give you two examples.